Okay, so we're going to do chapter 9, which is the chapter on organizational management conflict. And at this one, for this chapter, I'm just going to go straight through the PowerPoint presentation. It's basically a publisher oriented, publisher created PowerPoint presentation of the chapter. I'm just going to plow through it, go through it quickly. I prefer Prezzies, but Prezzies take a long time to create. And at this point, we're just going to go through this. I'm also not going to edit this. Normally I edit it and condense it. So therefore you're going to go through a lot of slides. I'm going to go through relatively fast, like always, knowing that you can pause and take notes. And hopefully this will help elaborate on and elucidate some of the concepts that are in the chapter. So that's it for now, and let's dive into the chapter. Okay, so now we're looking at conflict in general, and it's important to understand a couple of things. One is that conflict is inevitable, uh, and we tend to have, by and large, a very negative view of conflict, and that can come from a lot of different reasons, whether it's media, whether it's previous experience. But ultimately, conflict can either be destructive or constructive, functional or dysfunctional, based on us, based on what we do and how we handle conflict. So we really need to get over this inherently negative view. Some of us are conflict avoiders, and we would rather simply disappear than do any kind of confrontation. And whether that's on an organizational level or on an interpersonal level, it's something that holds back relationships and effective decision making. So it's something you have to learn to work through. And I know it's not easy. I speak from experience on that one. So in terms of defining conflict, this is the infamous definition of conflict. This is also the definition of conflict that's used in interpersonal communication. But it's developed by Poole and Putnam in 1987. It's been around for a while. And one of the things to look at, you can pause this and go over the actual definition, but if you just look at these I's, these three I's, incompatibility, interdependence, and interaction, those are the three I's that come up in the definition on the page that we just looked at. But incompatible goals, you have two people who want two separate things. You have interdependent behaviors. In other words, what person A does is going to affect person B. Interaction means it has to be an expressed struggle. There has to be some type of interaction on some level. It's not considered a conflict if the guy behind you flips you off and you're unaware. That's not conflict. It's not conflict if your roommate wants to go to San Diego for the weekend and you want to go to San Francisco and you both have your own car. That's, there's no interdependence. There's no, the idea of incompatible goals. It's irrelevant because of the situation. So all of these variables have to be present in order for something to be considered conflict, ultimately on any level, not just on organization. Levels of organizational conflict. Certainly interpersonal, meaning, let's say, the person you share a cubby with, or you're on a team at work. That can be interpersonal, intergroup, your small task force against another task force, and different organizational conflict on a much larger scale. These phases of organizational conflict, these are interesting. This comes from a chart on page 164, and you can go to this. Just the chart alone is enough for you to understand it. But there are many people who really like to look at concepts and break them down into the requisite stages or phases. And some interesting ideas discussed in this notion of phases of conflict. Now, in terms of managing organizational conflict, people used to focus on the term conflict resolution, and typically that implies that conflict is resolved to the mutual satisfaction of both parties, and frankly that's not the case, because many times conflict is resolved to the satisfaction of both parties. It's not resolved. I didn't get what I want. I had to compromise. I had to give some things up. We had to find a place that we would both be satisfied with, in terms of just resolving the conflict and making that go away, but not necessarily resolving the conflict in terms of getting what we wanted 100%. And that's because of a lot of different variables. This should look a little bit familiar to you, conflict management styles. If you remember back to the human resources relations chapters when we talked about Blake and and Newton. They came up with this grid dealing, from that human resources relations point of view, and the same grid has been used as sort of the foundation for conflict management styles. And it's an interesting way of looking at them, and they're all, you can see them here, there are 5 of them. Now this approach has been critiqued, and obviously people criticize almost anything. One is that it doesn't really reflect the complex nature of conflict, but most importantly, it doesn't allow for changing styles. I can start out in a certain style of dealing and approaching the conflict, but throughout the conversation, perhaps I'm suddenly beginning to feel very insulted by your demeanor, and so therefore my conflict style changes. And no longer am I, willing to accommodate you, but now, frankly, I'm just a little peeved altogether, and I would just assume you don't get anything. And so my style has changed in the middle of the, dealing with the conflict, and that's not really allowed for in that grid approach. And then there are some other variables that you can see here. New directions. In this approach, it's basically an idea that let's pay less attention to conflict styles. Let's quit trying to put people in boxes. A particular style equals this particular person, but rather pay more attention to the components of the conflict, the components of a specific message, the perceptions of the parties involved, and that it's sometimes you simply have to agree to disagree, and how functionality and conflict can be managed through that approach. The idea of bargaining and negotiation. Remember, bargaining is a very formal activity, and I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in a large-scale bargaining or negotiation process. It can be very, very draining. It typically involves third-party individuals. It's very formal, and like it says here, there's clear understandings of rules in negotiation. There are 2 different types of bargaining: distributive and integrative, and it's important that you understand those differences. Here we have that notion of third-party conflict. Many times conflict can be managed and resolved through a third party, whether it's a friend or a coworker, whether it's a supervisor, whether it is a formal mediator or arbitrator. This is true in all levels of conflict. I know of people who've gone through a tough time in their marriage and called in a third party, a friend, to come over and basically sort of mediate between the 2 of them because they just couldn't seem to find resolution. So it can be a very effective technique to resolving conflict on all levels. The big differences between a mediator and an arbitrator, these 2: a mediator has no decision-making power. An arbitrator, you're giving basically power of attorney. You're giving them the right to make a decision. So very interesting. And there are specific tactics that are used by these mediators and the arbitrators within their resolution process in order to come to that resolution. And these are some of the 4 that are illustrated and discussed in the book. Now, at this point, the chapter takes a little bit of a turn and begins to look at some of the factors that influence the process, how we resolve. What are the variables that influence how we resolve conflict? And first of which is relational, or rather personal factors. Personal factors, obviously there's different personalities. You know people, you have people in your family, you have friends in your, in-group, your friend groups, who love to argue, and you immediately know who that person is. There's so-and-so, and oh my gosh, they just love to give them an argument, and they're just going to beat it to death. And you know people who simply don't like to argue at all. So personality has a strong influence. Gender differences, stereotypically, men, it's been said that they don't flee conflict as much as women do, but that's a very mixed result in terms of what the research actually says. Personal factors, again, framing. Framing is your approach toward the conflict. And again, people's past experiences have a tremendous amount to do with how you frame conflict. If you have been raised in a situation, in an outcome, in an environment, or been bombarded with media that portrays conflict in a very personally destructive, inflammatory, loud volume, big gestures, tons of drama, and that's what conflict is to you, well, then realize that you are going to walk into any organizational conflict situation with that same paradigm, that same frame, that same perception. And that strongly, very much, is going to influence how that conflict in the organization is managed when you're a part of it. Relational factors have to do with the relationships between the parties. A variable that comes in very pronounced in here is the examination of power. And in power and organization, we're frequently talking about authority, superior, subordinate. So there can be dollars on the line. There can be a job position termination. This whole idea of hierarchy, and that could be a tremendous influence and a tremendous pressure on the organization. The notion of relational factors in terms of autonomy and connection. If you have had interpersonal communication, this term should be familiar to you. When we talked about dialectic tensions, that sometimes a couple in a relationship can struggle with the balance of autonomy and connection, wanting to be their own person and yet be very intimately connected to this other person in a relationship. The same is true within a family. I have two teenage boys, one 13, one 17. So that there's this struggle for autonomy and connection. Growing up, wanting to be their own person, they're still, wanting to be with mom. I mean, there's a balance. You remember, most of you are past that age, you've gone through it, and it's a struggle. You fight for the balance. That's a relational factor. Then there are cultural variables. Cultural variables can influence in a very profound way that many times people are sadly ignorant of in terms of cultural variables. I teach intercultural communication, and I am amazed at the influence that culture has in the process of negotiation, in how conflict is resolved, how messages are communicated and received, and the differences are profound and have a tremendous impact in dealing with conflict, whether that's interpersonally or organizationally. The alternative view of conflict, this section predominantly deals with some new approaches to conflict that frankly come from feminist organizational theory. And what I think is really neat about this approach is it focuses more on the notion of dialogue, and it focuses more on the notion of community and what conflict does to the community. Really interesting paradigm, really interesting approach to look at conflict. Less of this idea of, or this focus of just breaking it down into styles and what works. So anyways, that is a quick summary of Chapter 9. Actually, wasn't that quick, but I think we're done with this. Have a great week.